Okay, hello everybody on the line today. Welcome to this webinar on modern slavery in the construction industry. We're joined today by two wonderful speakers. We have Matthew Friedman, founder and CEO of the Mekong Club, and Justine Currell, who is Executive Director of Unseen UK. We will have a little bit of time today to do a Q&A session towards the end. So if you have any questions for either of the speakers, please feel free to drop them into the chat box on Zoom. You can either direct them to me personally. My name is Phoebe Ewan at the Mekong Club, or otherwise just simply put them into the chat box. And we will do our best to address all of these questions at the end of the session. So with that, Matt, I will hand over to you to kick off. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Phoebe. And thank you all for being on today. And we want a special thank you to Justine, who is going to be the keynote today. I'm going to start off by just talking a little bit about my own personal experience related to the issue of construction and modern slavery. As many of you know, that I've lived in Asia for over 30 years, and I've worked in about 40 different countries. And the topic of construction often comes up in our discussions related to human trafficking and modern slavery. Kind of a typical example of what I've seen in Southeast Asia goes like this. There's a construction site in northern Thailand, and somebody from Laos crosses over into Thailand. He's interested in getting some work. He goes up to the construction foreman and says, you know, I'm looking for work. The foreman looks at him and says, okay, well, I can give you some work, but I can't pay you right away. You're going to have to wait 3 months, but don't worry, it'll be fine. And so the Lao person accepts the opportunity. He begins to work. He works for the 3-month period of time that he's agreed. And then he goes to the foreman and says, I'd like to be paid. Foreman then comes up with a couple of excuses. Well, you know, we haven't been paid ourselves. We're going to need a little bit longer. Come back in a month and then we can talk about it. A month goes by. They have another conversation, another excuse, another excuse. This process goes on for almost a year until this person is in a situation where he's heavily in debt. He hasn't been paid anything at all. The anxiety and the stress is building up significantly. He goes and he becomes a lot more assertive and aggressive. And then the next day when he comes to work, there's an immigration ban there. And he's picked up and he's taken to the remand center. As he's driving away, he sees a smile on the face of the foreman. And he comes to realize that he was never going to get paid. That this was just a ruse, basically, in order to get him to work. This type of situation is something that I've seen over and over again in construction sites, and it's one of a few variations on the theme related to how people are being kind of exploited. Now, the interesting thing about modern slavery and human trafficking is, you know, in the early days, 30 years ago, we spent most of our time looking at sex trafficking. And then we started to hear about fishing boats and sweatshops and domestic helpers that were being exploited and so forth. And it's almost as if there's kind of a light that shines on a particular sector. And once it starts to shine on it, then we begin to hear of issues and problems associated with it. And so the light has shone on sex trafficking, on forced labor in sweatshops, in factories and so forth, on fishing boats, but it really hasn't quite made its way to construction. We hear bits and pieces of it, but not to the same extent that we see some of these other sectors taking off. As an example of other sectors that are beginning to get under the spotlight, we see, for example, medical supplies. In Pakistan, there was recently a couple of articles related to kind of children in forced labor circumstances making surgical equipment. Recently, I spoke to a pharmaceutical company that talked about how they found kind of exploitative situation among their third-party distributors. We went to a law firm and they talked about how the people who clean their building in Singapore. And so the point is as the light shines on something, as the topic makes its way into the media, then all of a sudden it becomes a phenomenon. And this phenomena results in people being interested. And we're beginning to see more and more articles related to construction. So we expect that this is going to be a topic that we will have a lot more kind of emphasis on over the next couple of months and years. And in fact, you may hear from Justine that they've already been dealing with this in different parts of the world for some time. When it comes to kind of the related factors associated with this, sometimes we're dealing with a situation where the exploitation is actually in the factory or in the site itself where the construction is taking place, but there are also other related topics when it comes to this. For example, where some of the construction equipment comes from. The lumber could be kind of logged by exploitative labor. And when I lived in Nepal, we often had, if you look at the lower right-hand picture, people who would sit in front of these rocks and they would just break them into smaller pieces. And many of those people were also associated with what would be described as a forced labor circumstance. So in addition to construction directly related to the site itself, there are all kinds of other questions that have to be asked. Where are the construction supplies coming from? Have those construction supplies been tainted by modern slavery? How do we find out that? And we'll be discussing this as we go further into this. As we all know, the number of people estimated to be involved in modern slavery is about 40 million people. Of that, 25 million people are in forced labor. And a subset of that 25 million would include people who are in construction sites or related to construction businesses and so forth. And the numbers are in the millions. And so what we're talking about here is something that is important, is relevant, and it has to be addressed. With COVID, we anticipate that the possibility of there being more exploitation taking place. I've heard one figure where they said that the number could go from 40 million to 60 million. And the reason for that is that a lot of people who had work are being sent home. In some cases, they're quarantined, they don't have any savings, they're forced to basically borrow money. And that indebtedness opens them up to a situation where, the people who lent the money can come and say, well, you can't pay this back. I need a family member to come with me, work on a construction site for a period of time. All the money that is earned from that will come to me, et cetera, et cetera. So we anticipate that post-COVID, as things begin to ramp up, we may see even more issues related to this. In terms of the types of things that we see that are vulnerabilities, and I'm sure Justine will talk about this in more detail, but I'll just talk about it from my perspective. When I was living and working in South Asia, recruitment fees were a big issue, where a person from Nepal was told that they can go to Singapore, they can make a bunch of money. They're told that they have to put up $1,500 US in order for that to happen. They don't have the money, so they borrow it from the recruitment agency, not understanding the fees and the penalties and the interest associated with it. And by the time they get to Singapore, the amount could be up to 3,500, 4,000, 5,000, et cetera. And so they end up working for years just to pay back that fee or that debt. This is a form of debt bondage, it's a form of modern slavery. It's very relevant to what it is that we're talking about today. Contract substitution, where a person signs a contract in a particular country. Maybe they had somebody read it to them, it doesn't matter, but at least they understood what it said. And then when they get to the destination country, they are told that they have to sign another contract in another language, not realizing that by signing that, they are just going to further exploit themselves. And lastly, document retention, where a person gets to another country working on a construction site, but their documentation is taken. When they realize that this wasn't what they signed up for and they want to leave, they're told they can't leave because they're not going to get their documentation back until they finish what the contract is, which could be a very highly exploitative type of situation. So all of these things are kind of typical types of ILO indicators related to forced labor that we see related to a variety of different types of modern slavery situations, but it certainly does exist within the construction site. So what I'll do now is I'll just stop here and hand it over to Justine to carry on from there.
Great, thank you, Matt. Good morning, everybody. My name is Justine Currell. and I am a director for the modern slavery charity Unseen. Sorry, just bear with me a moment. Great. So really delighted to be here with you this morning to talk about obviously a very important topic, and the role of modern slavery and how that manifests in construction. I'm going to give a slightly different perspective, a UK perspective. Unseen has been around for about 14 years, and for the last 6 years we've been heavily focused on working with businesses, with governments, with agencies right across the UK and beyond, to really look at the issue of modern slavery and understand how it affects the various different sectors that we see here in the UK and beyond. Just for a bit of background, my background prior to being with Unseen was I was a senior policy advisor in the modern slavery unit within the Home Office in the UK, and I had the privilege of drafting the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK. So this is an issue that I've been working on for around 10 years, and I think it's something that we all need to focus on and need to understand that it does happen right across the world, and anybody, in fact, could be a potential victim. So just in terms of talking about modern slavery, tackling worker exploitation is absolutely key, but business activities really do fall into a requirement around being proportionate to the business, being relevant, specific, timely and cost effective. When I first started having conversations with the construction sector in the UK over 10 years ago, there was a real sense of it doesn't happen here, it can't happen here. We have a very, very complex modus operandi, and therefore it's too difficult for us to work out what we need to do in terms of tackling it. But I'm pleased to say that we've seen a shift over that time period. Is it where it should be? Absolutely not, but that's the same across all sectors. Some are slightly further forward than others. But I think this is an area where, because of that complex labour supply, because of the complex way in which the construction sector works with its subcontractors, it's an area that we really do need to focus on. And the point for me really is around continuous improvement. It's about always understanding what you're asking others to do, and really asking those questions so that we can continuously improve. So just to give you some context around what we see here in the UK. So there are around 1 million construction businesses in the UK in 2020 who employ over 1.4 million workers. Now that number goes up or down depending on which type of businesses you include, but around about 1 million. If you look at the Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline that Unseen runs and has run for the last 5.5 years, in 2020, we had 95 labour abuse cases reported to the Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline. Now, that's just labour abuse, so that doesn't meet the threshold of modern slavery here in the UK, but they are indicators that something is not right. Poor working practices, health and safety issues, issues around documentation. And one of the key numbers that I think is really important to recognise is that 27% of potential victims report financial exploitation to the Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline. Now, this is key because what we're seeing are more and more people being put into the construction sector as well as other sectors who are not being directly abused and exploited by the employer, by the business, that actually it's a third party that is orchestrating that. And again, this makes it that much more difficult for businesses to know and understand the signs, what they're looking out for and how they can prevent worker exploitation. But if you think about the number that we've just seen here in the UK, and obviously we are working within the confines of the pandemic, as is everybody else across the world, but 352 potential modern slavery victims indicated in the construction sector by the Helpline in 2020. That's important because we saw a decline across 2020 in a wide range of labour sectors. But the two that we saw an increase in were agriculture and construction, partly because they didn't finish working in the same way, they weren't shut down in the same way as other businesses. But I think that's really critical in terms of understanding the phenomena that we're seeing and how we can address it appropriately. And then if you look at the number of calls and contacts that we get into the helpline, nearly 8,000. So again, this is an issue that's not going away, and it's an issue that we are continuing to address and see on a daily basis. So just to give you some other key facts around construction itself. So thinking about this from an EU context, construction ranks second only to the sex industry as the sector most prone to modern slavery. And that again is because of a transient workforce and because there are very short-term contracts sometimes, or subcontractors are moving from one contract to another. As you've heard from Matt, it's an international issue. Construction consistently ranks highest in terms of risk of labour exploitation in around half of the EU countries as well. And we see that here in the UK. So it's always one of those sectors that is fairly prevalent in terms of what we're seeing in the UK. And then if you think about the money that is gleaned from construction as well as a few other sectors, an estimated $34 billion comes from forced labour in construction, manufacturing, mining and utilities. And obviously there are many more labour sectors that we could focus on, but that's a huge amount of money and it's so lucrative, and this is why people continue to look at how they can make money from others, particularly in the construction sector. Now, in terms of what can we do to help mitigate the risk, core components needed to develop a strong approach to mitigating modern slavery risks, we believe would sit around some kind of 6 key components. So auditing, we've always kind of had a bit of a feeling that, you know, too much emphasis has been placed on audits, and that's right across all different sectors. I think auditing plays a part, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all. I think add it to all of the other elements that I mentioned here today, and then you can start to develop a comprehensive strategy and a way in which we can start to mitigate those risks and provide more assurance to our own business, but also to those that we do business with. Policies and procedures are really critical, but it's no good having bits of paper. It's a bit like the modern slavery statement here in the UK. You can add anything you like to a piece of paper, but if you actually don't deal with that in practice, if people don't understand your policies and procedures, if you don't communicate those effectively, then obviously we will start to fall down, and we will find that there will problems will start to increase. Leadership and governance is absolutely critical. For years, we've seen businesses focused on having, you know, a small element of HR or a CSR or some other part of a team within a business, and yet there is no leadership and governance from the top. Leadership is critical, needing to set out the path for that business, but also the governance, understanding who is leading on the issue of tackling modern slavery, what the reporting mechanisms are, and that's absolutely critical. Transparency, again, I think is critical. I pushed for transparency in supply chains within the Modern Slavery Act back in 2014, and was really pleased that the government eventually took this on. There was a lot of external push also to have that included. But traceability, transparency, really knowing and understanding where your supply chains go to is key. It's very easy to say, very difficult to do, but some of these simple steps can help you to build up that approach whereby you can know more about what others are doing on your behalf. Communications and engagement are absolutely critical, whether that is with workers, whether that's within your own business, or whether that's with third parties. Really making sure that communication is clear, succinct, easy to understand, and the expectations are known on both sides. That allows you to avoid the tick box exercise that we see with lots of businesses, where there is an assumption that because somebody's told me something that they're doing, that they are doing that and I don't need to worry about it. And I think any business that assumes that they don't have any risk simply because they're asking a number of questions needs to think again. And then the one for me really around education, I think is the most critical. So raising the awareness, the understanding of the potential risks leads to better leadership, better governance, allows you to think about the policies and procedures that you can put in place, but it also allows you as a business to really understand those signs to spot and then to know what to do with it. So once you've spotted a potential issue, what do I do with it? How do I report it? How do we monitor it? How do we escalate it? And then how do we remediate against it? And those are all critical factors that will help a business to continuously improve. So in terms of risk factors, and obviously some of this is coming from the work that we do on the Modern Slavery Helpline, where we get calls and contacts from workers themselves, from labour providers, from third parties, from members of the public, and also from businesses themselves. So there are two things here for me. Right to work checks, the amount of businesses that we see who are circumventing formal right to work checks, particularly when they're under pressure, I think is increasing the risk, not only for the business, but more importantly for workers themselves. If we don't put the right checks and balances in place, then we are just creating an environment where we can allow modern slavery to survive and thrive. Cscs card checks here in the UK. Cscs cards are increasingly requested by employers and contractors, but we see many fraudulent cards in circulation. So there's a need to be vigilant about that within the UK. But as you can see, companies cannot be complacent about any checks, but in particular, you know, basic document checks, really making sure that workers have a right to work in the UK and that they actually have the paperwork that they need to ensure that they remain safe and well on any site across the UK. So in terms of risk factors for the UK construction supply chains, we see a lot of these within the calls and the communications and the engagement that we have, as I said, with workers and also businesses as well. And pressure on costs and schedules is one of the factors that we see most prevalent in the way in which businesses work. So actually feeling pressure on time, on costs, means that sometimes they are pressing down on others within the supply chain. And obviously, if you are cutting corners or you are really applying that pressure from the top, then somebody somewhere in the supply chain is going to have to pay the cost. And unfortunately, often we see it's the vulnerable worker at the end of the supply chain. Variability in labour demand, again, we've seen that throughout the pandemic. Here in the UK, we're feeling the impact of Brexit since the start of 2021. So labour shortages in some areas, and that has an implication in terms of how businesses are finding labour within the construction sector. Widespread use of subcontracted and migrant labour, as we've already mentioned. Large proportion of work at minimum wage. So again, where there are workers who are working at that minimum level, there are always challenges, particularly where we look at deductions being made from workers, payments being withheld for one reason or another. Industry reliance on self-regulation. Obviously we have rules and regulations, but unless somebody is doing those checks, then obviously businesses will look to, some businesses I say, will look to circumvent those, and obviously that's just increasing the risk to the workers, and that falls into a fragmented inspection system as well. So I just wanted to share with you some other data. Unseen works with Achilles, who are a social audit firm, and they have conducted some audit findings in terms of working with a number of construction sites. So I just thought this would be helpful to share with you. So 1,368 worker interviews undertaken across 28 construction sites, involving 588 employers, and 48 management system audits. So thinking about that, and the number of workers that we see within the UK, you can see there obviously a large proportion are UK nationals, but we do see many from Romania, and I have a case study for you at the end of my presentation, which I want to share with you. We get lots of other nationalities as well, so workers from 53 different countries. If you look at the information that we get from the UK-wide Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline, we see generally over 80 different nationalities of individuals being reported as potential victims across the whole of the UK and beyond, because we do get some calls on an international basis. But then thinking about what we see in terms of site level, and again this is data provided by Achilles, you know, workers reporting that they're suffering physical or verbal abuse. 50 workers stated overtime was mandatory. So, you know, this feeling of having no course of action other than to comply with what's being requested, generally with a threat of having to lose that role, that job, if you don't comply. And that kind of is an undercurrent that we see right across the construction sector, but also across other sectors as well. So 17% of workers charged administration fees, and we see a lot of workers picking up random fees, being required to pay for jobs in some situations, particularly where there's a third party and that third party has infiltrated the labour supply. Highest weekly deduction made in administration fees, 25%. 21% of workers identified as using non-standard documentation. So again, this comes back to one of the risk areas that I mentioned earlier, in terms of really making sure that that documentation is bona fide. And there are ways to do that within the UK. But quite often, even simple checks will help a business to become more resilient to the potential of modern slavery happening in and down supply chains. 5 workers reported cases of discrimination, and then obviously we've got workers reporting the loss or mistreatment of PPE. So again, what we have found with some of the calls and contacts that we get from the helpline is that people have to pay for their own PPE, and that quite routinely they are charged extortionate amounts for providing that PPE back to the business, so the business using that as a way of getting more money from the worker themselves. So again, just a few other key findings. I won't go into all of these in any major detail, but I think most of what we're seeing will result in people being exploited in one of a number of ways, either because they've paid for the work in the first place, or because they don't have a written contract that stipulates what they can expect, because they are not getting paid the right amount. So routinely either deductions being made or not being paid the appropriate amount for the work that they're doing. And then also outside of the workplace, we are seeing exploitation, so financial exploitation. We're seeing workers who are being forced to stay in houses of multiple occupations, so far too many people in one house, We are still seeing people being bussed to and from sites by gangs, and again I'll come on to that in my case study in a moment. But there are a number of ways in which we are looking at how to address these situations and these risks with businesses. And what we often find is, as we identify an emerging threat, an emerging trend, then that is circumvented by those who are trying to get round the whatever barriers we put in place. But also we need to recognise that we still need to keep our eye on the ball. It's no good saying, well, we checked 6 months ago. We need to do that on a continuous basis. So for me, in terms of KPIs, so performance indicators, and what we should be looking at in terms of businesses working in the construction sector, responsible recruitment is key across any sector or industry, quite frankly. And I've mentioned the issue around training, education and awareness raising. For me, that's absolutely critical. If you don't know and understand that this can take place in your workplace, if you don't know and understand how it might manifest, if you don't know how people might infiltrate supply chains, then you're not going to spot the issues. And as we always find here in the UK, the media, the press, they won't care about, you know, that small subcontractor. They're looking for the big name to put in headlights. And so making sure that the due diligence is applied right throughout the supply chain is really key. Worker voice and engagement, I think, is critical. Really knowing and understanding what's happening at that base level is really critical. And again, it should be an ongoing feature of doing good business. Worker voice and engagement is really critical in knowing and understanding what's happening on the ground. Clearly, pay conditions and working environment, and how you instigate an environment that enables people to get the right amount of pay, that work in health and safety, an environment that's conducive to health and safety, you know, is really critical. And even just having that expectation with those that you work with, knowing and understanding how those risks can manifest, can really help you to put in place an environment that really works, not only for yourselves, for subcontractors and also for workers. And that brings me on to the final two elements. Third-party engagement, which is absolutely critical, needs to be regular, needs to be consistent. Never make assumptions about any of the conversations that you have with anybody else. It's very easy to say, don't worry about that, we do X, Y, and Z. But actually, as a business, you have a requirement to really know and understand what others are doing on your behalf. And then reporting, escalation and remediation. There should be effective routes for reporting potential issues, for escalating those where they can't be resolved, and then also looking at remediation. How do we remediate where a worker has not received the money that they should get, or has been treated fairly badly? So that's the end of my presentation. I have got some contact details there if anybody wants to get in contact with me. But I thought it might be helpful to just give you the basis of a case study that we have dealt with here at Unseen, that came in via the Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline. And obviously we get cases all the time that are reported to us that involve labour abuse or potential labour abuse, and somewhere we deem them to be modern slavery. So as a call comes into the helpline, we're always making decisions about what indicators we are hearing and what the next steps are. So this particular case involved a Romanian gang who were supplying labour to a business within a construction site. So they were a subcontractor on a construction site. They had worked with a labour provider, but they were actually calling all the shots. So they were putting out various different calls on Facebook, on other social media channels, and really trying to get others to sign up to accepting the job. And apparently this is something that we have seen within the Romanian community. So it's an accepted practice that somebody within that community will put out a job advert and that people will respond. What we were seeing is that the gang behind this were then charging those workers to take up those jobs. They were working with a recruitment agency, and they were placing those people into this larger subcontractor. What we found was that not only was there an element of that debt bondage, so obviously they were having to pay back, not only pay for the job, but then pay for accommodation that was being supplied, and there was some element of financial exploitation that was happening in the background. The site manager identified that there were some issues with some of the workers. They didn't seem to be engaging appropriately. Some of them were not able to speak very much English at all, and some of those issues that they saw on the site, they felt didn't sit well with them. So they contacted the helplines for some help and advice, and we advised them to try and find out a little bit more information about what was happening on the ground, and through some very sensitive and very carefully worded questions, we managed to establish that yes, in fact, these workers had paid for the job themselves. What we also found was that there was an element of being unwilling to explain who that crime gang was, and who was actually orchestrating all of this. But we see that kind of issue with workers all of the time. What we then wanted to do was actually work with the business and say, okay, well, how did this happen? What due diligence did you apply to the agency provider? How can we make sure that we reduce those risks? What escalation and reporting mechanisms do you have in place? How do you engage with those workers when you realise that they were not able to speak good English? And through all of that, we developed a process for that business to actually improve their resilience to modern slavery. We ensured that workers whose first language was not English not only had their contract in other languages, but also that we had information on sites about contacting the Modern Slavery Helpline, for example, but had those in the different languages so that those workers were able to ask for help, to seek help through the helpline, and for us to continue working with that business. We also made sure that we set out how important it is not to cut corners if you're under pressure. And again, this comes back to the kind of cost and time, really making sure that when you are employing a subcontractor, you have a good understanding of how they are working with their agencies, what checks and balances they're putting in place, and that it's not just for that subcontractor to provide assurance back to you. Look at and ask for evidence of what they are doing, because if we don't do that, then we are again 1, 2, 3 steps removed from any decision-making process, and that's where the risks can really start to infiltrate your business. So in terms of really making sure that we can know about the types of risks that businesses are seeing, particularly here in the UK, we know that rogue individuals, third parties, will try and infiltrate the labour supply chain. We have seen a few rogue agency labour providers, and so really making sure that those agencies that are utilised right across the piece, whether this is directly on a site or whether, as we've heard before, it's somebody that's working, cleaning your offices, cleaning the offices of a construction company, you know, any other hospitality. In terms of making sure that your business is mitigating risk, you have to apply due diligence right across your business. And what we did with the business in question, with the Romanian crime gang, was we really worked with them to undertake some gap analysis, to look at their policies and procedures. And it comes back to that wheel that I provided earlier, really looking at the leadership and governance. How often does the board see what is happening? How often are reports going up to the board? Who is the senior leader responsible for dealing with issues around modern slavery? What worker grievance process do you have in place? How is that then reported? What do you do as a result? Making sure that everything that we need to include around raising awareness, and also around making sure that we continuously improve, we offered to that business, as well as the education, so training for managers on sites, which we've done with a number of construction businesses. And that's really critical, because right at the front level, knowing and understanding what you might see, knowing how people might circumvent any processes that you put in place, and knowing what to do if you identify that is really, really critical. So hopefully I've given you a flavour of what we do here in the UK, what we see both from the helpline, but also the work that we do with businesses. As I said, my contact details are there, so any questions, more than happy to oblige. Thanks, Matt.
Justine, if you can just take your slide away, we'll put it back up after. I just want to show one more slide here before we get questions and answers. And what I'd like to do is just encourage people to put some questions into the chat. I see that there is one question that's come in. We'll look at that in a moment. What you see here with this slide is just to kind of recap some of the things that Justine said, with the core components in the 6 core modern slavery KPIs, and even within the example that she just provided. It's really important to learn about the topic. Awareness raising is abysmal in many locations. I think Europe is farther ahead than Asia when it comes to some of these topics, making sure that there's a policy statement related to modern slavery, and that people know what the statement is, and they actually operationalize that. Have point person or team within organizations to address questions and referrals. This is essential, simply because, you know, we work with companies that kind of had 3 or 4 people focusing on this particular topic, but there's no point person. And so if an emergency comes up, a case arises and so forth, there should be somebody that you can go to. As Justine mentioned several times, the importance of training not only the people who have a relevant stake in addressing this, but C-suite, and also the contractors and subcontractors, and in the languages that they have risk assessment strategies. Justine talked about audits and grievance mechanisms and various other things. Those are hugely important, simply because if you can't get feedback from the people who are in these circumstances, you don't really know what's going on. But lastly, and this is the one that perhaps I just want to really emphasize, is that what do you do when you find a situation where you have the possibility within your construction business forced labor circumstance? Who do you approach? How do you address it internally? How do you go about kind of ameliorating the situation and making it better? All of these things, essential parts of the process. And with that, we're going to open this up now to question and answer. You can go ahead and put your information up there again, Justine. And I see that we have one question. Can you help us to see what it is, Phoebe?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Justine and Matt, for such a engaging presentation. So the question is from Daniel, who's representing a client organization actually within retail. They're doing risk assessments, audits, communication, engagement sessions, etc. And it's stated, or it's been stated within the presentation, that it's important to ensure that you're continuously improving in this space, right? And kind of given the recommendations that you've just made, Matt, how would you suggest a company actually kind of measures this improvement over time in a way that is meaningful?
Justine, why don't you go ahead and start with that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. So thanks for the question, Daniel. I think it's a really important one because many businesses don't really know where to start. So I think the way we've worked with businesses is very much around a gap analysis. So then knowing where you are and then having conversations about where you want to get to. With one particular business that we've worked with over the last 18 months, we've put in place an action plan so that you are able to monitor progress. So we've looked at training, for example, and we identified that yes, there was limited training, but it was very, very generic. It wasn't really related to the particular sector that this company was working in. And so really understanding, well, what do we need to look at in terms of a gap analysis? You know, all the policies, procedures, all the areas that we've talked about this morning, looking at leadership and governance and comms and kind of how you remediate. And if you haven't got any processes in place, then look to establish them. But by putting in place an action plan, training, knowing that, okay, well, we've got a generic bog standard training that some people get, and actually our ambition is over the next 5 years that we're going to provide comprehensive training for those who need it, but general training that's related to our sector for everybody. Then you can monitor your progress against that. The same with policies and procedures. You know, how often are they reviewed? Do you have the right policies and procedures in place? And if you haven't, how do you establish those? Understanding what you need to put in those policies and procedures, and then having a review mechanism so that you can monitor activity around the policy, that you can review it, and that you have evidence to show that you're doing that. And we just go, I would say, go through it systematically like that, document everything, and then you can put in KPIs, you know. For example, training, okay, well, we've had 20 people in one particular department that's had this generic training. Over the next 5 years, we're going to include everybody within the business. I'm going to have some very specific requirements around procurement or HR or third-party teams, and then know how you're going to document that and how you're going to present that back to that point person that we've talked about being so crucial within an organisation.
Yeah, and just to add to that, thank you for that, Justine. You know, the thing about forced labor situations in general is they're never the same. There may be some consistency in terms of some of the factors, but there's no really kind of off-the-shelf cookie-cutter approach that's going to solve every issue. Every single case that we deal with requires us to sit down, talk about the factors, and then determine what are the implications of these types of things. And so kind of reaching out to organizations like Unseen and the Mekong Club to have conversations related to cases that come up is part of what we do as a regular part of our business. And so it's really important if you find yourself in a situation where you don't know what to do next, to reach out to organizations like ours. We have experience working on these types of things, and that experience often translates into being able to provide advice and guidance to help out organizations that are facing issues.
Great, thanks. We have another question that's come in that's focused on helplines. So maybe to Justine first, from your experience, are these kind of helplines typically independent from local authorities? And do you have any advice when it comes to engaging with helplines or setting up a helpline to ensure that there's no conflict of interest in the situation?
Yeah, so first off, the helpline that Unseen runs is completely confidential and independent. So we are not paid for by the UK government or by local authorities. We deal on a one-to-one basis with those callers and contacts who come to the helpline for help and support. We always work on a consent basis, so if it's a particular worker themselves, we work with their consent, and we never do anything to, you know, our mantras do no further harm. So you know, if a person's in a pretty bad situation, then we won't report it unless they want us to. The same with businesses. We work confidentially with businesses. We in fact have set up a Helpline business portal, so we work with a number of businesses across a number of different sectors. As we get cases in, we will report situational information so that it gives businesses a better understanding of where things are happening within the UK, and what they can do, and they then can call on us to help and support them if we need to be around. So for example, we've had one case recently with 3 businesses that we work with, all being supplied by the same supplier. And we've been able to facilitate conversations, agree next steps, work out what we should do, get some worker interviews in place, and we've actually supported on the ground with those. So that's something that we do. Other helplines do other things. You know, most helplines are in some way are financially supported by their government. So, you know, for example, in the US, Polaris operate a hotline, and they get about 40% of their funding from the US State Department. So, but we are completely confidential. And I think that's really crucial because it allows us to have those confidential conversations with workers. And so, you know, for anybody working across the UK, we would recommend putting the helpline number up. It's free to call, and people can get help and support if they're in a pretty bad situation.
You know, here across Asia, we have a certain number of hotlines that are used for people who are in exploitative situations. The one thing that's essential, though, is being able to ensure that you're able to accommodate the many languages that exist. Often people who are calling hotlines are calling because they are not in their home country and they don't really understand the systems and procedures. And because they're not in their own country, it's easier to exploit them. So hotlines work best when you're able to kind of adjust to the fact that the people who are calling in speak all different types of languages. I believe in Unseen's case and Polaris's case, you have systems and procedures to address that. We don't have as much of that here in Asia yet, but that's certainly something that we can work towards.
Yeah, Matt, you made a really important point about, you know, we've got access to translation in over 200 different languages. And as I mentioned earlier, more than 80 different nationalities that we usually see, routinely see through the helpline in any one year. So, you know, that's absolutely critical. And providing that service means that we get more and more individuals contacting us, because that's routinely used to help and support individuals who are working in the UK.
Great, thank you. So Justine, if we look specific at the construction centre in the UK, what kind of proportion of projects would be government, public, kind of local government type projects? And if significant, how do we assess the quality of due diligence within these kinds of projects where it's not a private sector company, it's kind of local government carrying out the project?
Well, yeah, a great question, and really, really quite tricky. And this is where transparency really comes into being. Now, obviously, we're looking, you know, the requirement for public sector to report on what they're doing is coming into the UK. So I think that's important. But again, I would stress, you know, having been at the centre of introducing the Modern Slavery Act back in 2015, and the slightly odd conversations that I sometimes have with businesses around what they should or shouldn't do, and the fact that somebody's got a statement, so that's fine. I think we need to look beyond that. So it is difficult because the full transparency is not there yet, but we're trying to get there. And I think, you know, we in the UK have been overtaken by some other countries who have now brought in stronger legislation around this issue. But I'm confident that even by requiring you know, the public sector to report in the same way as the private sector around the Modern Slavery Act, that will help us to get more transparency, greater transparency than we've had previously. And then obviously, as part of that, there's a requirement to put your statement on a website and have it readily accessible to those who want to see it. So the intention of bringing that in was always to increase transparency and allow people to see what others are doing, and to then test that, to ask questions. That hasn't quite happened as much as we would have hoped in the UK, and obviously we're looking at stronger legislation in the coming months when parliamentary time allows. But I'm hopeful that we're going in the right direction, albeit maybe not quick enough.
You know, I'm thrilled that we're moving in the direction that public tenders are being included in, you know, the legislation that we're talking about. And the reason for that is, look at the size of public sector kind of tenders. You're talking about US government, government of the United Kingdom, many other governments have huge programs that they put in place, infrastructure projects, you know, dams, roads, everything else. And so ensuring that we move in the direction of holding the public sector tenders at the same level as the private one is a major kind of goal that we should all be looking at, because what it does is it ensures that we're covering all of the people that are in the process of working in construction equally as this tender process goes into place.
Great, thank you. Justine, in your experience in the UK, do migrant workers have good access to trade unions? If so, is this an avenue through which they can kind of exercise their rights and get access to justice?
Yeah, I think yes and no. In some areas, yes. In others, in many others, no. So we have and do continue to work with unions, worker representative organisations, to try and raise awareness of this issue and to hopefully work collaboratively. But I think it's the same with, you know, a response to modern slavery, very sporadic. And we need to have these mechanisms in place that work really well. So where you have worker engagement, worker representative, where you have union engagement, and it's strong, then obviously the ability for workers to report on what's happening to them, and you know, for the business to know and understand more about what's happening on the ground obviously is key. But as I said, it's fairly sporadic.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. So we have mentioned that the use of subcontractors can be a real area of risk, and this isn't just exclusive to the construction industry, right? So do we think that kind of pushing to reduce the use of subcontracting within construction or any other industry is a good way forward to try to reduce that risk of modern slavery? Do you think this is a good idea and could lead to some positive results, or what are your thoughts?
My personal feeling is that I wouldn't necessarily urge moving in that direction. Some of these smaller subcontractors, subcontractors need to survive, need to be out there doing things. We just need better due diligence, better awareness, better oversight, better ways of ensuring that you know, people who are within the construction industry can share what their situation is. You know, the construction industry needs specialized people who perhaps are subcontractors, and sometimes the larger organizations don't have those skills. Justine, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think trying to stipulate or dictate how a particular sector should work, I think it is difficult. But I also think, and this applies across lots of different sectors, kind of the business at the top of the shop really needs to take some responsibility and ownership. So understanding, well, if I've got a complex supply chain, then I need to have better mechanisms in place. And it doesn't mean kind of really costly processes that need to be put in place, but we need to get the basics right. So that kind of expectation management and assurance and what we do to understand what others are doing, I think is critical. And applying that, as I mentioned right at the start of my presentation, around being proportionate. So obviously requiring a small 10-man construction subcontractor to undertake exactly the same as somebody who employs 300-400 people, and we just need to be proportionate. I think we need to take the lead, and I think we just need to give a helping hand to those who are much smaller. We've introduced, for example, and you can see it on the Unseen website, an SME toolkit, which just gives much smaller businesses a bit of an understanding of, well, what do I need to do? What are the risks? How can I address them? What should I be looking for? What further help can I get? And that's free. So, please do go on to the Unseen website if you think that might be of any help or use to anybody on the call.
Well, I want to just thank you all for your participation today. Justine, thank you. Great presentation, very insightful. Our contact information is available. There'll also be a short survey. I'm going to ask Phoebe to just talk a little bit about that, but from our standpoint, thank you so much.
Yep, thank you everyone for participating and for all of the great questions. It's really helpful for us to get feedback on these types of sessions. So as we close, a survey will pop up on the screen. If you don't mind taking a few seconds to fill it out, it will help shape sessions like this in the future. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to Matt and Justine for a wonderful presentation.